Hello, and welcome to Creative Corner, presented by LearnPLay Foundation. I'm Josh, and today I will be teaching you Lightroom. Was that all right, Rob? So welcome to the Lightroom tutorial from LearnPLay. I'm going to be delving into how I go about editing photos, a nice little run through of my workflow. So let's get right into it. Okay, so getting right into it, I recommend putting on your favourite playlist, listen to some music while you're editing some photos. But the first step you want to do is to import some photos to edit. So you press import and your locations for importing photos come on. Right now it is chosen to choose the USB I have plugged in right now for the import location, but I don't want that. I want to go down to my hard drive. I will then go into my projects folder, and then I will find the Lightroom tutorial folder here. Select it, deselect the videos because I don't want to input those. If we get to look, they load. So we have a GoPro image, we have an image sent in by one of the apprentices here, got an underexposed picture of an apprentice here, Rob, assessor Andy, and just a standard generic image. So to view each image before you import, you use the two buttons down in the bottom left. So you have your full library mode, then you have the single view mode. So I've checked all of the images I want to import. Now I'm going to click import at the bottom right. But now we are in the library mode. I'm only going to run through today the library and develop modules. So if you wanted to, you could right click and deselect the slides that you don't need to use. So for example, I'm only going to keep library and develop up here. So this is your library section. They will number the images on import 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What I'd recommend doing first though is see if you've got a large batch of photos that need to be edited. I'd go into single mode, and if you use your number keys, you can set a rating for the photo. So if you've got 2,000 images and you want a quick way to sort everything, just use your arrow keys and the number pad. So let's set this one to a 4, set this one to a 5, let's set this one to a 3, 2, 1. When we go back into the library section, you can see that they have different ratings. If you come down to the bottom where it says capture time, you can change the sort mode into the rating. So Andy will be first because we have 5 stars. So with that set, the next part is to just click the develop module. Now whatever picture you select down at the bottom, it will go into. For the basics of editing, I will start off with the image that an apprentice brought in. I'm going to pull this side panel bar as far as I can. This will give me more finer control over some of the settings rather than having a super tiny bar to move everything on. It's just way too sensitive. So if I pull it open, I can then see each different slider and then have finer control. So if I wanted to go up one, I'm able to do that. If it was smaller, I'd be going up in increments of 5 or 10. Starting off with this first image. It's not a bad image, it's nice exposed. It is a smartphone image in a JPEG format. Obviously with JPEG you've got a loss of quality. You can see some noise. It's not a lot of sharpness to it. It's just all around just a really generic photo that you take with a phone camera. So over the process of starting to get used to editing, you start to see issues as soon as you look at an image. So for example, this image, I'm looking, so this area is probably blown out. This whole area is either a cloud or it is just super grey, which means that camera hasn't picked up the information that was in that segment. So we've got to be careful that this area here doesn't all change block colour. We're also, if you look at the line here, it goes off into, instead of being straight down the middle or straight in line, it goes off in a diagonal. We'll come around to fixing those individual problems. So I'm just going to divert your attention to the side panel here. So this is your histogram. This will show you where all your colours are falling within the photo. So we've got a lot of shadows, we've got a lot of highlights, nothing really around the middle. You have each of your menus. What I like to do, because once these are open you have to keep scrolling up and down, I like to right click solo mode, and when you open a new one it'll close the previous one. Note how basic tone curve, HSL, split tone in detail, lens corrections, transform, effects and camera calibration are in this order. You don't need to follow this order when editing a photo. To start off with what I do, I'd first immediately come into transform. So with transform, it's going to proportion the image properly and skew the image in a way that will make it, I like to say, flat. And basically you're reshaping the image so it fits nicely into the border. So if I show you, if I click auto, it's going to rotate to what it thinks is upright, and it's going to pull different areas. So up here it got a lot wider, down here it became more condensed. So if we just look at the difference it's made, so it's done a rotation and also a slight distort to the sky here. As I'm looking at it though, there's still something off about these two canal locks. So what I'm going to do is open up crop, which is up here, and then I'm going to rotate to what I think is straight using the guides, and yeah, I've got it. So now we've got two parallel lines set in and we've got a nice center. There's no weird distort across, so you go straight horizontal, you go straight up and down. So after the transform, I like to come into lens corrections. Now, what lens corrections do, most lenses are made out of glass, which slow down the speed of light, so it bends the light. So what Lightroom does is correct that effect based on your lens. So I'm going to remove chromatic aberration. That's like whenever you're shooting against light, you'll get, say, like a neon green or a neon purple, maybe it's orange, and it's a really sharp neon line. I'm going to click Enable Profile Corrections. So it's asking me for the make of the lens profile. So I know that this was shot on an Apple iPhone 4. So I'm going to click Apple, and because of the metadata already in the photo, it's chosen Apple iPhone 4S, and then it's choosing the Adobe profile. And if we just take a look at what it's done, if I keep going backwards and forwards, so this is what it was before, this is what it was now. It seems like a slight difference, but what you're actually doing is getting rid of the distort on the house and making the image flat as the eye would see it. So we've done the lens corrections now. I'm just checking if it is too over cropped, because I want it straight, but I don't want the buildings to be going down at a diagonal. I want it flat and flush. So my horizon's got to be flat and my vertical is going to be flat. So enter. Each image that you ever edit will come with different problems, new problems, probably the same problems, but depending on the photo, you're going to edit slightly different each time. So, for example, if we take this picture of Andy, what I'm going to show you in the tutorial is that you'll use the knowledge of one picture to find out how it works in a second picture. So I go to basic, I'm going to start off with basic. I'm going to refrain from using the exposure because it's just something I wouldn't do right now. I think it's a nice even exposure across the board. I don't need to boost anything, I don't need to pull anything back. I will probably just go straight to my highlights. If you look at the histogram, it's broken up with whites, highlights, exposure, shadows and blacks. So each of these sliders will control the colours or light in these areas. So your highlights will affect things like the clouds. Your exposure will affect mostly like everything pretty much. Your shadows are areas like the dark areas here, and your whites will do the super bright areas and the blacks will be the super dark areas. So I'm going to show you how I'd adjust to get a much nicer detail out of say like the sky or the shadows. So I'm going to pull the highlights back till when I like the light to like shine through the clouds with some colour. So if you look at it before, this was like a grey, but now when you pull the highlights back it turns into a nice orange, and I really like that. Darkening it though has brought in some noise, but we can fix that later in the edit. With the shadows, for example, around the trees, if we wanted more detail in the grass or on this pavement, we'd boost the shadows so we can see that detail. Again, when you pull out certain highlights and shadows, you do tend to run into a lot of noise, but that can be cleaned up later on. So this is where things change a bit. So with the whites, you're really trying to counteract some of the overexposure. Now, this controls what pixels are completely white, just a dead white pixel. So if I hold down Alt, the image goes black, but this allows you to monitor whether you're overexposing. So as I pull it forward, I'm spreading and pushing the whites over, and then as you can see, I'm overexposed in a lot of the clouds. So I'm going to keep pulling it back once I'm overexposed to barely where there's any light overexposing, and that's about this level. And now I'm going to do the same with the blacks, but I'm going to pull the black to the darker side. So I'm going to hold down Alt, I'm going to pull it down. Now there's more freedom with blacks. I'd like to tend to let it bleed in a bit more. So we've got some like nice contrast going on. So if we look at what we've done so far, if we go back to the history panel at the side, if we go back to lens profile, what we've done is brought in some of the colour that's already in the photo that you really didn't know was there. I've brought out the blues in the skies, brought out some of the more lush greens, brought out this tree a bit more, and it's actually quite defined the barges in this picture. Next is clarity, vibrance and saturation. Now the best way to explain clarity is it boosts contrast in your mid-tones. So it doesn't do what contrast does, and you have super dark shadows and super bright highlights. Clarity will do it just for the mid-tones. So if you look at the histogram, it's pulling together more of the middle of the histogram. So I'm just going to pull it up, I'm going to play around with it. You can really overdo the clarity, but unless it's a style choice, I wouldn't recommend. I'm going to pull it down because if we look here, we get some white haloing, and I really don't want that. I just want a bit of definition. So around 10 or 11 will do, where it's really bringing out the crispness of the barges on the canal. So vibrance and saturation, they sort of do the same thing. So vibrance happens before saturation. So if you think of a spectrum, vibrance is at one end, and then saturation is in the middle, and then oversaturation is at the end. Vibrance happens up to saturation, and then saturation starts happening. I'm not a saturation fan for this. I want to kind of bring some more colour out of the sky, but not enough to where I'm overdoing it. What it's starting to look like is like an old person's jigsaw, and I'm kind of liking that aesthetic right now. So pull down the basic. I'm now done with basic. Tone curve is used in so many different ways. Most notably is how you get that faded black hipster fade that everyone uses on Instagram. So I'm just going to level out the tone curve. This allows me more finer control whenever I add another point without changing this line too drastically. I'm going to pull a point here, and then I'm going to pull the last point up till the blacks start to fade into a grey colour rather than harsh black. So if we look at that compared to the vibrance, I'm smothering some of the detail, but it's a style choice really. If we look at channel here, I can change the channel to only control the reds, or only control the greens, or only control the blues. So what I could do if I wanted was going to boost the blue in the shadows, and I'm going to do this the opposite to the red, and I'm going to boost the red in the highlights. So I'm getting a nice teal colour in the some of the highlights of the clouds, which I really like. I'm going to close the tone curve. HSL. I was going to leave this for one of the extra photos that we've got to show you some different cool things that you can do, but to do a really quick rundown of what it does, you get to control the individual colours in the photo. So any red pixels in this image you can change using this slider. So if you've got red in this image and you want it to be orange, you can change it to orange, or you can have it magenta. So if you look at the horizon there, you can see that I'm changing the hue of the red pixels. So I could have it more orange if I wanted to, but I'm really liking the red sunset. Plus, it doesn't just change this part, it will change the colour of, say, like this barge. So that barge is now orange, that barge is now a pink. I just want to boost the red slightly a bit more, bring in some of the sunset, bring out the red in the sky to come through the blue. So for example, for the blue, we could have a really teal blue, or we could have a purple. But I like a darker blue, because now what we're pulling through is a teal, some red, a bit of purple to like come out to like highlight some of the even smaller details, which I really like. Then after changing the colours of each colour in the image, you can boost the saturation of any colour you want. So see, to combat that weird outlining when you're changing a saturation is to use these dots. So if you click these dots, you can drag on the photo to increase or decrease the saturation in the area that you've clicked and drag on. So I'm clicking on the photo, I'm dragging up to increase saturation, I'm dragging down to decrease saturation. If you double click on any of the names of any effect, it instantly resets it to 0. So if I set this to 57 and I don't want it, double click, goes to 0. I'm not going to play with any of the saturation here though, because I think I've got a nice baseline of where I want the image to be. So done the hue, done the saturation, now it's luminance. Luminance changes how bright a colour is. So for example, if we look at this sky, I can make the sky dark, or I can make this sky super bright, but I'm already okay with the colours being where they are, so I'm going to go to the next tab, split toning. Split toning is like the tone curve in which we put colour into the shadows and then put colour into the highlights. Now this is a much simpler way. If I quickly turn off my colour edits on the blue and reset my hips fade and then go into split toning, I can do exactly what I did in that tone curve, but easier. Gonna go to my reds, gonna boost the saturation, I'm gonna go into the shadows, I'm gonna boost the blue in the shadows, and then I'm gonna adjust the balance, so if I want it more red or more blue, depends on what I'm looking for. I'm gonna go with more red, but I'm gonna boost the saturation to some of the blue. And basically, I'm just spitballing on what I want this image to look like. I don't expect anyone to do exactly the same, because your personal tastes come into it and all that will play a part in what your final edited output is. Sharpening will add an edge to all of the lines in the picture. So if I boost the sharpening, you can see as I increase the sharpening, it's also sharpening the noise in the sky, causing like some weird snaking effect, which really you don't want. I'm going to pull back the sharpening to about 25. I'm then going to select masking. Now, if you hold Alt on masking, you'll get a white square. Anywhere that's white, when you're holding Alt on masking, is being sharpened. So as I pull down, the black areas aren't being sharpened. So I'm going to keep pulling and pulling. So I don't want that sky to be sharpened at all, because that's where a lot of the noise is. You don't want to sharpen the noise. I want to keep some of the trees in, keep the finer details in, and that's the masking done. If I go onto radius and press Alt, you can see where the sharpening effect has been added. Now you can increase how thick that border is, or you can decrease how thick that border is. I'm just going to decrease it a bit, increase the detail to about 50 to just make it sure that that sharpening effect has presence. Next up is the noise reduction. Noise reduction will remove most of the noise that I've been talking about previously. So it smooths out all the little artifacting, so you get a smoother image. A lot of the issue is with noise reduction is when you've got small fine little details, noise reduction views that as noise. So for example, if we look at all the collection of white flowers on the tree, it will register that as noise and then will smooth it. Just to explain what the luminance control of noise reduction will do, we'll just put it to 100% and you can see the sky smooth. We're missing detail in the pathway. The clumps of flowers on the tree are just a glob. Same with the detail around most of the windows and doors. Probably around 25 is a safe baseline most of the time. While I've got the 25 though, the trees in the far back are getting slightly smudged, so I'm going to just boost the detail to try and bring them back in. Just the little tiny details here. The contrast will adjust the individual pixels, so you won't get that weird artifacting when the luminance on the noise reduction is happening. So I'm just going to bring that up a bit so we get a bit of contrast between them. This brings us on to the color noise reduction. Now, the color noise reduction is usually noticeable when you're shooting low light scenarios. So when the sensor on your camera isn't able to pick up light information, the sensor tries to put colours where they aren't. It's usually in the form of greens and purples. Most of the time, let me just move my selective cursor, so like over the highlights. Most of the time, it is green and purples. Moving the colour slider, you can even out most of the colours. What it does is it sees a pixel and then it looks at all the pixels around it and will try to even out the colour across those pixels. You can increase the detail to just refine some of the actual detail edges like we did in the normal noise reduction, and then of course you can adjust the smoothness. So you can have it super smooth or not smooth at all. I'm just going to leave it about 58. I could spend a lot of time doing a noise reduction, but I really like how the noise in this image automatically has like this old grain effect, which I really like, especially for this image, meaning that we don't have to put grain on in the effects panel, which we'll come into. So we're done with detail. We already did our lens corrections at the beginning. We also did our transform at the beginning. Now it's on to effects. These effects will be vignette, grain and dehaze. So your vignette, the more you pull to the left, will be dark. Then the vignette, when you pull it to the right, will be light. You can just where the middle point of your vignette happens, so you could have it just the corners, or you can have it super drastic and have it in the middle. But again, it's usually a style choice. I don't like the vignette. If I needed my corners darkened, I'd probably use the brush tool up here. We'll get into the brush tool later. Just as a quick one, just to darken the edges, I'm gonna put the amount to full so I can see what my vignette actually looks like. I'm gonna pull the midpoint out a bit. I'm then gonna add a feather, which will gradually smooth the vignette in, and then you can adjust where your highlights are being let in or let out. So you can keep your highlights in, or you can let your vignette affect that. So I'm just going to pull the amount back because I don't want such a drastic vignette. A vignette will try and direct the looker into the center of the image, but I like the darkness around the lower corners basically, which isn't that bad. So the next effect is grain. So you heard me talk about grain when I was talking about noise reduction. With the noise already in the image, we probably won't need to add grain to the image, but just so we can see, adding grain to the image adds artificial grain. Now you can change how big that grain is, or you could just make it super small and really fine. Then you can affect how rough the grain is. So more roughness is more like the shape of the grain. You'd usually only put a slight amount of grain in. I'm probably going to increase the roughness and the size though, and then still bring the grain back a bit, just so it's slightly seeable. I'm kind of happy with that. It looks like a really nice old vintage picture that you'd have on a jigsaw. Obviously everyone's edit's going to be different. Most of the cleanup will be the same, so like your transform and your lens correction when you're exposing, but when it comes to colours and what you can do with the picture, it's entirely up to you. Just kind of quickly turn all these settings that I've chosen into a preset. Now presets are a great way to transfer effects over to multiple images. So if you have a batch of 2000 images and you don't want to edit them the same way every time going through all the menus, create a preset, press the preset on all of them. Usually it will do a good job of like editing the photo. Maybe you'll need to change some of the highlights, maybe you'll need to change the exposure just to make it work well with that image. The way you do this is you see the presets panel, you press plus, let's call it vibrance grain. In the folder user presets, which will be over here to the left. I don't want to keep the white balance because I'll adjust that. You can change the sliders after you've added the presets. I'm going to keep the tone curve for the fade, going to keep the clarity. Probably won't do the sharpening, I'll just do my own sharpening on the next image. Keep the colour treatments and the split toning. I haven't used any filters. I won't keep the noise reduction. I won't keep the lens correction just in case I was using a different lens. So for example, I don't want the same lens corrections for each of my images because I use completely different setups. I won't keep the transform. I'll keep the effects, keep the process version and calibration all checked. So I'm going to create. So as you can see, I now have a preset called Vibrance Grain. If I open up my history and I click reset in the bottom right, it will reset the image to its former self. So I'm going to quickly close the history tab and then I'm going down into presets and then Vibrance Grain. It will add all those effects that are just edited in that little section back onto the photo. So if we take this picture of Andy and put the vibrance grain on Andy, Andy is now a little underexposed for my liking, so I'm just gonna bring the exposure up a bit more. You see this neon line here? This neon line is chromatic aberration. I don't want it because it just looks out of place, it's too harsh. So even though Lightroom's tried to do it automatically, I'm going to do it manually. I'm going to get the dropper and I'm going to select the colour that I don't want there, so it would be the luminous green here. And if you look, it removed most of it. Unfortunately, it didn't remove all, so I'm just going to pull the amount down. I'm going to select most of the green area, so we've removed a lot of the chromatic aberration. We've applied the preset from the last photo to Andy's picture, and it looks alright. Andy, though, is a bit red / pink. So if we go to our brush tool, I'm going to double click the word effect to reset the brush. It's important to do this every time you create a new brush. So I'm just going to expose Andy's face a bit more. I'm then going to try and cancel out some of the pink, which comes to temperature and tint. If you want a white background, you might see that it's a bit green. If you've got a green background, you adjust it to the more pink side. So if we take Andy for example, if Andy was really pink, I'd pull it down to the green side to cancel out most of that pink without turning him too green. We don't want him looking ill. But if we go back to before we added the brush stroke, Andy was slightly underexposed and really pink. Now he has more of his natural skin tones coming through, so he's no longer that bright pink. So that's laying on a preset, then understanding that you can go into the image later and adjust some things that are wrong with the image.